everybody hear me just fine? That good? Sweet. All right, well, welcome to session 2 of, what do we call this? Now, there's better be not any bad mojo back here because this was working. We've had technical problems. I don't know if you guys were here when we had technical problems last time. So we've attempted a fix. Perfect. That means none of you are on your phones right now messing with my Wi-Fi. So if anything goes wrong, I know it's one of you guys right there. So fundamentalists get uncomfortable when I say science is theology. So what do I mean by science is theology? Okay, what I mean very simply is a concept where all of us are familiar with, and it's in the Bible. What does Romans 1:20 say? God has put into the things that he has made things that show his attributes. Part of his character is manifest in the things that he has made. That's a term we call general revelation. And it says that it's so powerful that anybody, anywhere, born anywhere on planet Earth, as Paul says in Acts 17, he's put us where we're going to be so that we would grope for him. Romans 1:20 and 1:21 says they're without excuse. That's how powerful general revelation is. So yes, and the analogy I like to use is, if I'm on what I think is a deserted island, and I find a set of footprints in a campfire, well, the first thing I know at that point is I'm not alone. Of Scripture and God's revealed will is the highest form of theology, okay? But the church also needs to be well versed in general theology. If I'm going to study, I'm missing something about his character that I could otherwise know. So that's what I mean, and that's all that I mean when I say science is theology. Is that what it says? Yes. Part 2. All right, let's get rolling. So, did anybody recognize this Brazilian hypersensitive receiving satellite? This is part of what started in the 70s under the MEDI program, and it became known as the SETI program. Anybody ever hear of the SETI program? Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Now, if NASA and other corporations are pouring billions of dollars into something with high-tech equipment, you better believe they have a belief that they can achieve the goal they set out. What was their goal? To look for intelligent evidence coming from outer space, which would prove what? If I hear somebody calling me from across from the lobby, I'm assuming someone's in the lobby. Now, you have to have a mathematical definition of information in order to recognize information if and when it comes. Anybody ever see the movie Contact with Jodie Foster and, yes, it's about the SETI. It's a fictional story about the SETI program and how it might look like if they did get information from outer space. And essentially what they received from outer space was the first 20 prime numbers repeated over and over again. Now, if you're listening to outer space, you won't find something that specific, that information bound, okay? You'll find static. That's natural. Information by definition is something that does not happen naturally. So static and symmetry happen naturally. So pulsars spin, the planets and the pulsar stars spin, and they send a rhythm back to our satellites. That's not information. But a mathematical formula is not naturally occurring. So I'm going to take, if that small amount of mathematical information is proof of intelligence, I'd like to, in outer space, I wonder if we use that exact same mathematical formula in inner space, biology, would we trigger a thumbs up in terms of finding information? That's what this whole talk's about. It's going to be a little bit technical, but that's good for you. So machines have what's one key to a machine, a hand-built processed machine? Every part no part is redundant, every part is necessary. So this is probably one of the more basic machines you can come across, a mousetrap. And it's often used as an example when people are promoting intelligent design theory in biology. What part of that machine that you see there could you take away and have it still function? The answer is none. Every single piece there is necessary in order for it to catch a mouse using the cheese as bait. So when I come across an even more complex machine, I have an even greater confidence that what can I know if I stumble upon a machine that I didn't build? That there's a machinist outside of myself, okay? So if I came across a robotic arm with joints, circuitry, connected to a hard drive, it was able to do fine manipulations, would I turn around and then say to a friend of mine, did you see that? A windstorm must have gone through a junkyard and through pure chance assembled something such as this. Now everything in that arm is the materials for the plastics, the wiring, everything. All the materials, all the chemistry in this device is found where ultimately? The crust of the earth. They're natural products, but they're combined in ways that don't naturally occur, right? And then they're assembled in ways that don't naturally. We all know this intuitively. There's no need to hamper on that point. Now, if this is evidence of design and ingenuity, what would you call that? There's a joint system, just like in the robotic arm. There is a hydraulic delivery system known as a circulatory system. There's an electrical system known as the nervous system, using electrical impulse. It's all to feed the soft tissue, including the muscles, which are the contractile tissue, to give it the actual motion. And none of this would last 24 hours because of infection and pathogens without an integumentary system, the skin system to protect it, a sleeve to protect it. None of the chemicals all the chemicals that exist in this arm are found in the crust of the earth, but not in the combination that they are, just like we find industrial plastics. So if there's a non-naturally occurring, irreducibly complex machine, whether it's organic or synthetic, do I not have the right as a biologist to say, can I at least put on the table of the origin of life theories the idea of something purposed this to happen? I don't know exactly how it happened, I wasn't there, but the idea of blind, purposeless chance and accidental steps towards this can and should be challenged the same way that 100 years ago, when the actual math on outer space, and we talked about this last lecture, began to show that at some time in the past, the universe had begun to exist. But that went against the prevailing notion at the time. 100 years ago, you went to Oxford or Yale, whatever, the physics center would teach you that the universe had eternally existed forever. And what did we come to find out because of the science? It was resisted against, it was not accepted wholesale, but now we believe that the universe, based on the science, began to exist in a millisecond, not a millionth of a second, known as the Big Bang. That's the current theory, whether you agree with it or not, but that is the current theory. The reason it was resisted is it sounds a lot like Genesis 1:1. And they said as much. They said this is pseudoscience. This is pseudoscience hiding a religious plot to take over the universities. Well, say what they will, it turned out to be, it's currently the prevailing model of the origin of the universe, that there was a start. What about intelligent design? Now, believe it or not, you won't see this on the news, but because of the constant advancement in our understanding of what biology is, intelligent design theory is gaining momentum outside of churches. It's just because it's just like Big Bang cosmology, it has tons of evidence backing it up. So this man in the 1850s came up with what we consider today the Darwinian macroevolutionary theory. Again, not the first to think of it. The Greeks were talking about this in the 200s BC. And it's a fine hypothesis as far as I'm concerned, because if I look at how things grow, embryos turn into humans, little seeds turn into flowering plants. It seems like there's a natural process to explain everything. What if there's a natural process to explain the creation of a seed in the first place? It's a fair hypothesis. It doesn't mean it's true, and it should never be bodyguarded against being tested or criticized like we're going to do tonight. So, and by the way, even if it turns out that there was a natural pathway to take the crust of the Earth's materials and have it wind its way up to the level of human machinery, human biology, etc., the question would then be like, why is the Earth able to produce intelligence, information, and machinery? Is it itself the product of a designed mind? That would be a fair question. But maybe God made it even easier for us and made the spontaneous, purposeless, undirected march of life not a possibility, as a clue of his presence. So there's three basic things that have to occur that are the basis of macroevolutionary models. Number one is life is so unlikely to happen, it happened maybe 5 or 6 times in different parts of the planet. Therefore, all of us, elephants, palm trees, humans, everything, would have to have a common descent funnel down to a very few base population. Okay? That's something that has to be true for this theory to be correct. Number two is that because we started from the same amoeba-like substructure, it would be one little accidental mutation at a time, taking us one step at a time, marching forward through life as it diversified and became more complex. That would have to be the case. Not making this up, this is the very wording of evolutionary theorists. And how do you get those one step at a time changes? Purely accidentally. Okay? A mutation is something that happens every time a cell reproduces, and it happens like lightning striking, absolutely it's like if I tossed a marble from here and I hit the keyboard back there, and that would be an accidental keystroke while somebody else is typing, very, very complex and fragile computer code. Okay? Now, I want to look at mini machines to see if there's a clue as to whether or not there's a criticism that we can level at the theory we just looked at. And by the way, in Darwin's time, we talked about this last lecture as well, they had no idea what an animal cell was made of. Their microscopes were only able to see an animal cell, and essentially they called it a simple gelatinous unit. They thought it had nothing in it. It was just like a little piece of jello, literally. And in his desk, in Darwin's desk, a letter that was left unopened, and we found it there after Darwin died, was a letter from Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics. And he says, I think I've cracked the code to genetic information. And they thought life and character traits and like beak finches and finch beaks and other traits in nature were very simplistically occurring. For example, why is it that when you have red roses planted next to white roses, sometimes there's a cross-pollination and you get pink roses? Well, in their thinking, they're like, it's like mixing paint. It's like the traits just mix like paint. It's simple. Well, it turns out that is not how it works, right? If you want to pin your hopes on a theory that was developed in the 1850s, my question to you is, what other technologies and medical procedures from the 1850s would you rather have now trumping modern theories, right? Do you want bloodletting when you go to see your doctor instead of antibiotics? It killed George Washington. So one thing you see, not just in the insect world, but in the general animal kingdom, is something called convergent evolution. What is convergent evolution? If I see an exact same body part or chemical process in several different species that are not linked to each other, that's a little bit curious. For example, can you guys read that, by the way? Yeah? Okay. Similar or identical systems arise in different species at different times in different geographical locations. For example, bioluminescence. It's a very precise chemical process that produces a cold light, that way it doesn't kill the animal it's being produced in, that causes phosphorescence. There's a very specific jellyfish, other animals have it, and they all use the same chemical pathway. So you're looking at this chemical reaction, and it manifests itself in deep sea fishes, glowworms, octopi, and fireflies. That is strange. Isn't it fair for me to say it looks like a very specific tool, which they don't share with their other very similar insects and similar octopi? It appears like a tool that a designer thought was neat or appropriate for certain functions, and he applied it to different organisms that were not linked evolutionarily. Okay, what are the chances that in these different environments they would develop? It's problematic enough to create a system this complex by accidents. It's even more problematic for it to appear almost like willy-nilly in different species unconnected to each other. More it looks like, if I was to come up with a halogen light that works better, I'm going to put it, and I'm a car manufacturer, I'm going to put it on my SUVs and my mopeds and this and that, right? Irreducible complexity. If a system cannot survive if one item is removed from it, then that sort of flies against the notion that you can build machines from the ground up, one modification at a time. If everything has to come together at once for it to have even one function or survival capacity, then it would have the mechanism of one step at a time based on a single mutation at a time suffers. The bombardier beetle would be an interesting example. So it in its abdomen uses a chemical reaction to squirt out hot gas and oxygen at 100 degrees Celsius, okay? And this is all done in a abdominal weaponry system. You've got the little green or the little pink arms at the very front there. Those pump hydroquinone into the chamber with hydrogen peroxide, which begins to get it to be volatile. The sphincters prevent the transfer of the green gas into the final orange chamber, because as soon as that happens, there's an explosion. You're looking at a machine where you could not remove a single one of its parts. This is just on the actual organic level. The computer coding to code for that is even more complex than the structure. So you've got two different problems here flying in the face of accidental, one step at a time arrival to a system such as this. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, that I have the right as a biologist to look at this and say, accidental? One piece at a time? Well, can you at least propose a mechanism, right? And I actually went looking for that when I was in university, and to my shock, even evolutionary biology textbooks don't discuss mechanisms. When I was taking organic chemistry, when you actually look at the mechanisms for everything when they propose a new medicine or they propose a new industrial chemical, they can draw out with organic chemistry the possible pathways to achieve what they would want to achieve. They can at least theorize it. There's very little theory on how any of this could happen genetically, which is interesting. And here he is using his weapon. I don't know if he's committing suicide but they can actually point that in any direction. This guy he's tired of living under a Trudeau government. He's done. Metamorphosis. Here's an interesting thing. You've got a caterpillar, and when can caterpillars breed? No. Butterflies breed for the caterpillar. Isn't that interesting? Now, the metamorphosis system, if you've got a caterpillar and this would have happened as an accidental mutation in one little lowly caterpillar in all God's green earth, gets a point mutation in his system that leads towards something that might look like, if thousands of other mutations keep going in that direction, the chrysalis stage, the cocoon stage. But it wouldn't be able to go through the whole cocoon stage to a viable butterfly that then goes on to propagate the species. How do you advance one step at a time through the metamorphosis process, right? You can't. It has to be a completed system already chemically, genetically lined up. That is a huge border to cross, because how many thousands of millions of mutation points would have to happen, and they just happen to keep happening in the same family of caterpillars to start to create the chemical internal reaction system that could do something as intensive and complex and fragile as the entire chrysalis to metamorphosis process. Okay? It appears to be a system that has to be completely present right off the bat. Natural selection based on mutations is the 1-2 punch, the only viable mechanism proposed by Darwinian macroevolution. So what happens is nature will select, let's say like the famous example when Darwin was a young man, he was the resident physician on the HMS Beagle, a British military ship gone on a biological exploratory mission. And off the coast of Ecuador in the Galapagos Islands, he had the first time that he had a mechanism in his mind that was triggered by his observations. He saw that in different Galapagos Islands, different types of finches prevailed. So in places where there had been drought, the tough-beaked finches almost had wiped out every other finch on the island. The reasoning it was, when you have had a drought the previous season, there's only the dried, deeply buried seedlings from the last floral season for food. And if you have a tough, thick little beak, you can actually crack those and get food. If you have a fine, long beak, you're dead in the water, literally. So that was nature selecting one feature over another. Now, how do you get those features? In Darwin's day, they didn't really have an answer because they didn't know about genetics. Since the discovery of the genetic system, the mutation of genetics has been pressed into service as the mechanism that would create change within a species on an ongoing basis. So mutation is the bedrock, and I'm talking accidental lightning strike mutation with no designer in mind, no purpose, pure absolute lightning strike. Okay, that's necessary for evolution to be correct, the correct view of the origin of life. So DNA happens to be what gives us all of our features. DNA is basically the hard drive of the human organism. The next 3 minutes are going to be the most painful 3 minutes of your week. But if you can kind of get the gist of what I'm saying, you'll know more about evolutionary theory and origin of life theory than 95% of your friends and family. So bear with me. What exactly is DNA? Now, there's DNA. It's surrounded, it's not in your cell, it's in your cell's nucleus, because it has to have the right pH balance fluid for it to not degrade. It's a preservative. And inside, there's very tightly controlled portals in and out of your nucleus that tries to stop bad genetic copies from going out and wrong types of micromachines to go in, because your cell is filled with micromachinery. Inside the cell nucleus, there's specialized micromachines on the smallest possible scale that have a very specific and delicate function. Do you guys see, do I have a little pointer at the end of this? Am I supposed to have a pointer on this, Dan? Is there a laser pointer on this? Okay, perfect. This little machine goes to a precise location in the DNA strand because proteins, information to build a protein is only so long, and it's in a very specific place on a DNA strand and in a specific part of the DNA as a whole. These machines know where to find them. So they'll splice and tear in half the DNA in just a single location. That's this machine's job, the helicase. And then other machines like the polymerase come in, and you see how they're creating a carbon copy of this DNA strand. It's actually a mirror image. Do you see that? Each one of these little colored sticks are a nucleotide base pair. So think of the word base pair. These are the ones that can undergo mutation, and the wrong one shows up, a green one shows up where a blue one should be. Mutations do happen all the time, okay? By accident, as a degrading process, as a destructive process. But anyways, so what you're doing is you're getting a line of little sticks as a mirror image of the DNA built by this micromachine along with a host of other micromachines. Okay, that's the first thing. Your DNA is not actually proteins. It's information. Okay, so once you've got this RNA, this is called an RNA strand, what's being created right there. So the RNA strand is then first copied off your DNA, and now it's the yellow spaghetti. It gets taken to the pore complex, and if it's proper enough of a copy, it's allowed out. Then it's brought out to here to another micromachine. So the RNA copy of your DNA is this, and now we're going to zone in on this. This is very important. So here's the RNA strand right there. Every 3 base pair lines up with the 3 base pairs on their tRNA, another micromachine. And this is all happening in a ribosome, which is another micromachine. So every 3 base pair is like a key that locks with a tRNA. These little balls, this bead necklace that's being created here, are all individual amino acids. So the copy of your DNA right here, the RNA strand, is simply to give the tRNA the correct order in which the beads are supposed to be placed. Now, an amino acid is to a protein what an individual letter is to a sentence or a paragraph or a page. Proteins are just reams and reams of amino acid chains. So this is the first step in creating a protein. And by the way, you're mostly made up of protein. Your hormones are all protein. Your bone is a form of calcific protein. You're almost purely protein. So this is the body plan, and which cells trigger which part of your DNA's protein is all based on the environment that cell finds itself in. It receives chemical signals from its environment. Like, I could give you loads of levels of complexity of what we're made of. Now, this is just the first step in building a protein. There's 3 other steps which all have to do with how it's that bead necklace. It has to be perfectly folded in order to function. One wrong fold, it usually does not work at all or is highly deficient. So there's 4 levels, 3 levels beyond this. You got to get the order right, and then you got to orient it just right so it doesn't attract to the wrong part of it and then collapse. It's extremely complicated, just to give you an idea. So the idea that you can accidentally get, if I switch out, if this U ends up being a T by accident because of a genetic defect in my DNA, that would actually code for an entirely different amino acid. And I'll show you an example in a little bit. One wrong amino acid can kill you, okay? How could this accidental process program more and more new information? Because to go from a nematode to an elephant is an innovation process. It's like going from an old school Pong video game and the programming for Pong to Fortnite. Okay? We're talking reams and reams of carefully programmed, intelligently designed information. How could mutations be that mechanism? Now, somebody asked that point blank to Richard Dawkins, and we'll see his answer. Are you there, Justin? Okay.
Genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop one? I think.
I'm recording.
Okay.
That's good. You can stop it there.
There's a popular misunderstanding.
What he goes on to say, by the way, for about 30 seconds, is he gives a general overview of what evolution might be. But one thing he does not do is ever answer that question. You can go online and look that up yourself. He goes on to talk for 30 more seconds, but he goes, evolution's the theory that all life came from the comet. Yeah, we know that. We just criticized the mechanism, the main mechanism, and you saw his answer. This is a leading biologist, an evolutionary biologist. Had no answer because there is no answer. There is no answer. Now, to give you an example of how fine-tuned our body machinery is, these are all the chemical, one step after another. They all trigger one step. It's like a domino, those fancy dominoes you see on the videos. They set them up and they flick them and they brrr. This is the chemical cascade, they call it, for you to form blood clots. Too much blood clotting, you die. Too little blood clotting, you die. It's a very fine edge system. Now, von Willebrand's disease this is over here. There's a bundle of chemicals over here. The V11, the Roman numeral 8 here, is von Willebrand's factor. It's an enzyme. If you have one single base pair, remember I showed you the base pairs, those individual columns? If I have one, it's called a point mutation, when you have a single mutation in one single base pair. If I get a base pair mutation in the part of my genome that codes for the von Willebrand's factor, I have a defective von Willebrand factor. What does that spell? That causes hemophilia. Okay? That's how we kill rats, by the way. Warfarin in rat poison is basically a huge dose of anti-catalysts that block your von Willebrand's factor and does it for the rat. So the rat, as it does its rat life, squeezing in little holes and doing all that stuff, begins to get internal damage like they normally do, but they normally just blood clot and move on, like we do. I do jiu-jitsu, I'm constantly getting bruising, but I'm not dead, because my body can control my blood, my internal and external bleeding. Well, when you can't, if I took warfarin and did jiu-jitsu, I'd be dead, right? So not only, that's one point mutation wrong out of thousands and thousands of base pairs involved in the cascade. Imagine if I remove the von Willebrand's factor entirely. This system would not work. Again, this flies in the face of the notion that you can build us chemically and mechanically one step at a time. Which step here could you remove? You can't even remove a base pair from one of these dozens of enzymes. How much less could you remove the entire enzyme? It's a good question. These are normal-looking blood cells. Now, your beta global gene, sorry, I usually have everything by memory, but that one tripped me up. The beta globin gene, for the inside your red blood cells, you have hemoglobin, and you have 4 of them. You see that sort of, it looks like a Celtic mask there with 4 eyes. These are 4 different hemoglobin molecules chained together. They carry iron and oxygen. That's what makes you be able to live. The majority of your cells in your body, we have something like 30 trillion cells. I think like 21 trillion of those are red blood cells. Or sorry, 16 million. Your majority of your being is just red blood cells. You're basically a blood-soaked piñata. Now, in each of these hemoglobin chains, they're made up of 147 amino acids. Remember, amino acids was that bead necklace that was being formed by reading the RNA? Number 6, the 6th amino acid, is swapped out in this particular disease because there was one base pair mutation on the RNA, one mistake. What happens is the hemoglobin attracts itself to itself and collapses. And what does that create? That creates sickle cell, highly compromising your blood's ability to carry oxygen or iron. That's why it's called sickle cell anemia. Now, if both your parents give you the sickle cell gene, you're dead, probably around 5 years old. If usually it's only one parent who passes it on, so you have about 30 to 40% of your blood cells constantly collapsing, your spleen has to catch it, destroy it, and start the blood kickstart the blood cell creation process. It's stressful. They usually have a much lower lifespan if you have even one parent giving you the sickle cell gene. So that's another example of the finickiness of biology. Last example. This is called fibrogrowth factor receptor site. Is that correct? I think I've got it up here. Fibroblast growth factor receptor 3. It's one of the many biological units involved in the growth of your long bones, or your bones in general. Okay? Now what it basically does is when you're growing, when you're a kid, if you took an x-ray of a baby, there's almost no bone in there. They're all cartilage. But then the cartilage turns into bone. And as you get to be a juvenile, you still are growing. So up until you're 25, you're not fully skeletally mature. And what you see is on the ends of your long bones are little zones of cartilage. And the cartilage is spitting out, secreting more cartilage, and the cartilage behind it is turning into bone. So it's telescoping the bone outwards lengthwise, okay? One of the key factors in this is this particular receptor site, which allows it to receive the right chemical signal to turn the cartilage into bone. Now, if it has a single point mutation in its gene structure, remember, this is one out of many, many hundreds of base pairs, if not thousands, you have, it affects the conversion of cartilage into bone, and it creates a disease called achondroplasia, aka dwarfism, okay, from a single base pair mutation. I remember in my x-ray class, I was sitting there going like, we were studying achondroplasia, and I remember when I read that it was based off of a single point mutation. They know exactly which one. I'm like, are we not knife edge precisely built? Neanderthal skull on the right-hand side. Who here has heard that Neanderthals are our actual ancestors? We come from the Neanderthal. Anybody ever hear that theory? Perfect. Do you guys know that we've solved that problem, by the way, about 15 years ago, because we completed a full genomic study of the Neanderthal DNA in 3 different specimens in 3 different parts, because they only appear in Europe. They're actually first discovered in the Neanderthal Valley in Germany, hence the name Neanderthal man. Now, we did a complete genomic study of the Neanderthal genome, and since the 2000s, we've had a complete genomic study of the human genome, and this is not controversial, this is something known in anthropology, they are not our ancestors. That has been proven. You'll see that it'll be taught in universities. That's what I'm saying is not controversial. It's a matter of fact. We are not there. So the story now becomes, we both come from a similar common ancestor that we haven't discovered yet. So the missing link is still the missing link. You can see the differences too, by the way. They have a smaller frontal lobe, that's why the skull can afford to recede, where ours bubbles right up. This is where all the high process reasoning happens. They have a sloping chin like all other hominids. We're the only hominids with a protruding chin, small masseter muscles, because we don't eat walnuts. We don't have to crunch walnuts with our jaw muscles. Large eyes and a huge frontal lobe to brain volume ratio. I mean, it was a fair point. It looks kind of human, doesn't it? Right? It looks like it's apes becoming us. But genetics have the last word. Look it up yourselves. We are now considered by for sure not related. We're cousins at best, not brothers, or not parent sons. Here's one representation that you'll see in museums of the Neanderthal man, based purely on conjecture, by the way. Okay, because here's the more latest version of what the Neanderthal might have looked like. Looks like this. An orc, basically. Nobody knows what they look like. That is, we do not know about facial hair based on bone structure. There's only bones. They've died out 50,000 years ago, so there is absolutely not a single soft tissue specimen of Neanderthal. But we have their viable genetics. We were able to isolate genetics. What is not considered controversial, which may surprise you, by the way, is that they did not make clothes. Every time you see a presentation of Neanderthal in clothes, not a single Neanderthal specimen has ever been found with clothing. And in their toolkits has never been found sewing needles. You have to have sewing needles, even rudimentary ones, which humans do have. As soon as you see humans in the fossil record, we have a whole set of tools, including sewing needles. There is no evidence that they had clothing. That is conjecture. There is no evidence that most anthropologists do not believe that they did not master fire, counter to a lot of the movies we've seen. The only fire they've ever been found near are open field fires, which were very likely naturally occurring bush fires. Now just like the chimpanzee, they've lost their fear of fire. Most animals haven't. All other animals besides some hominids have an extreme fear of fire. So there's a possibility that they could take an existing burning log, drag it into a cave, but we've never found actual remains of fire in a Neanderthal cave. Or that they would see dead animals near the fire, see that cooked meat tastes better than raw meat, so they would seek it out. We don't know, but there is no we know what a campsite or a campfire looks like. Early human history campfires can be found. And what you see is they reuse the same plot over and over again because it's the basis of the villager community, even nomadic communities. So you will see a certain deposit deep into the soil of a conical-shaped soot layer, not nada with the Neanderthals. It looks like they just lost their fear of fire. That is a prevailing view within anthropology. They also have no ritualistic burial practices. There's been some contention on that, but all they've ever found was one Neanderthal with pollen on his remains, and they thought, look, they probably put flowers on them, but you find pollen on remains of animals. It's not a conclusive evidence, right? No sign that they could speak. If you look up here, this top row is gorilla, orangutan, and chimp hyoid bones. That's the bone in where your Adam's apple cartilage is. And it has to have a certain shape for it to be able to have the type of muscles attached to it that cause the voice box to exist. Now, all these are human right here, and this one is Neanderthal. So they all are similar, but we know for a fact that the hominid class, the Pongidae class, which is gorillas, chimps, and orangutans, cannot speak. So we don't know if they could speak or not. Now, toolkits. Did they have tools? Yes, they did. The oldest known toolkit goes with the Homo habilis, and it's supposedly dated 2.5 to 1.2 million years ago. Now, it's difficult, as we'll see in a bit, other animals, even mammals today, can use tools. And the type of flaking process on the Homo habilis, what they call You'll often hear them, when you hear spoken about them in literature, it's called a hand axe of the Aldewan toolkit. And you think to yourself, wow, hand axe. These guys were making hand axes? Well, this is what they mean. And it looks like it wasn't necessarily intelligently sharpened, it was accidentally sharpened with repetitive use. Okay? Some of the rocks from that era do have the hallmarks of what appears to be intelligent sharpening. That's a possibility. But one thing to keep in mind, a whole million years in existence, 1.3 million years in existence, not a single innovation, just sharp rocks. Okay? There's a difference between our toolkits and their toolkits. And by the way, orangutans can spearfish. Did you know that? So before you think that a sharp rock means you're smart like humans, think of the orangutan spearfish. You're probably better than me. You can probably out provide for his family out in the bush. And chimps can fish for ants using little into logs using branches. And then my personal favorite, look at this little booby trap made by this little guy. This guy made this. It looks man-made, but this guy did it. How smart is this guy? Is this guy going to do your taxes? Right? No, not even the orangutan going to do my next medical checkup. And this is what that's a net. This is complete conjecture. We have no idea what they look like. What you see in museums and movies, when you read the literature, you realize 100% cultural product, not science-based. The Oculian toolkit belongs to the Homo erectus. Now, as you can see, it shows signs more so of intelligent sharpening, but it's still a handheld system. It's not stuck on the edge of a spear tip. It's not a spear tip. It's a handheld, most likely intelligently sharpened rock. And again, for over 1 million years, they had to improve on that technology. Did they? No. Sharp rock. Sharper rock than the other idiots. And this guy looks a little more friendly, but pure conjecture that he looked like that. Hey, you could have him over for dinner. The Mousterian toolkit is the Neanderthal toolkit. Now, clearly the most intelligently sharpened rock in the bunch. May or may not have been a spear tip. We don't know. But again, remember that orangutans can find and even sometimes nibble to sharpen the end of a stick to go spear fishing. These guys are still in the intelligent class, potentially, of the orangutan, okay? And again, you'll see this. Notice the clothing on there. Just remember, and look this up yourself, don't take my word for it, pure conjecture. No evidence to support they had clothing. Mostly counter evidence to the fact that they had clothing. That's one representation. Here's another one. And the most recent one, I kid you not, is the orcish gorilla-looking one. All based on the same mechanics of the skull crusher, and you can tell with the size, you can approximate the size of muscles on body and skull by the marks they leave on the skull, the indents, the fossa they create, the tubercles they create from repetitive use. You can approximate the size of muscles, but not skin, not facial hair, not intelligence, not even voice box. And their toolkits are a cue as to what their technology was like. So what about the human? Well, as soon as we appear, the oldest tools we have include sewing needles, fish hooks for fishing, spearheads, jewelry, currency, arrowheads, spear tips, etc. That is our worst, and it shows up about 40,000 years ago. Right as soon as you start to see humans in the fossil record, you see our advanced, quantum leap advanced beyond the other hominids. So that shows you the fact that, and again, we have evidence of things like specialized beads that anthropologists believe were used as currency, early currency. Okay? Now, to have the idea of, and we have cave art, we have stone flutes, we made music right off the bat, we had ritual burial practices, we had religious expression. So what is all of that compared to what we saw with the hominid toolkits? It's evidence of abstract thinking. We're the only ones who've ever displayed it. Yes, you can teach an elephant to draw a picture of an elephant, but that's a circus trick. No elephant has ever sat there and just saw an easel and just waltzed up to it and just started painting himself. When you see elephants painting themselves on YouTube, a crude representation, have you seen that? They do a crude representation. They're taught to do that as a parlor trick, the same way a bear is taught to ride a bicycle in a circus. It's not naturally occurring. It's humans imposing their hyper-intelligence on a lower creature. And so what do we do in 30,000 years? We start off better than everybody else, and remember, for 1,000,000 years, you had sharp rocks. That's all those guys could do. We took 30,000 years and came up with the International Space Station. Okay? Oops, sorry, wrong slide. That's our cave art, which is clearly art. You'll find scratches in the walls of Neanderthal caves, but it looks like someone's sharpening a rock. There's no rhyme or reason to the actual art. But we went all the way to the International Space Station in record time. Anthropologists call this the cultural Big Bang, our original toolkits, and they call the human manifestation of technology a quantum leap in intelligence. Now, the word quantum leap, when it's used by scientists, means it's so large it cannot be quantified. It cannot be quantified, it's qualified. It's such a large leap, it's an other type of intelligence. Does that not sound like us being the only creatures ever found that bear the image of God? Now, you will hear that we share some DNA with the Neanderthals. That is not quite true. I had a friend, she passed away, but she was the head of the paleontology department in South Africa. And I was communicating with her about this very fact. It is true that in some of our genetic areas, very few, we have genes that are similar to the Neanderthal. So the theory is we coexisted for some time. Did we interbreed? Now there's a problem with that, because if we interbred, that means that a non-human species and a human species are compatible. Okay, that's problematic in terms of God's creation, as far as I'm concerned. But the secondary problem is all the areas where we have similar genetics to the Neanderthals, which is very few, are what's called histogenic complex parts of the DNA. What that means very simply is it's the parts of your DNA that are affected by your immune system as it adapts. So, us and the sub-Saharan humans and the chimpanzees in sub-Saharan Africa have the exact same thing. How would you account for that? Because we know for a fact, and people have tried, we cannot breed with chimpanzees. Okay, that's how we got AIDS. People tried to breed with chimpanzees. So why would two unbreedable creatures share histogenic complex similarities? Very simply, when you live in the same environment as another creature that's similar to you in their immune complex and their adaptability, you both encounter the what? The same diseases, the same environmental stresses, and you adapt similarly to them. That was her, the paleontologist from South Africa, that was her firm understanding. And it's actually, it's split down the line in anthropology whether or not we interbred with the Neanderthals. But my version of the story is I think it's more likely shared stressors environmentally and pathogenically with those creatures. I'm seeing a lot of glazed looks here. I think this is turning into a science lecture pretty fast. Oh, and by the way, you guys heard the story that we have 98% of the same genes as the chimps? Anybody here think that's true? Who here would live or die on that one? Okay, thank you. You knew that was a trick question. The idea first circulated in the 1970s. Specifically, one single study in 1975 was done on a chimp genome, but at the time, both the chimp, we had studied less than 10% of the human genome and less than 15% of the chimp genome. And we declared that we had 98% the same genes. Now, clearly, we've fully completed those genomic studies since then. The latest number is 72% and dropping. Okay, but by the way, we share about the same amount of genetic information with dolphins. Okay, no one thinks that we're linked to dolphins. Clearly, I wouldn't be surprised if we have similarities to the hominid class, including the Pongidae class, the chimps and gorillas, because we have obvious similarities. We're similarly built in an animal sense, right? But it certainly isn't the 98% you keep hearing about. That's also more of a old wives' tale, urban legend type thing that keeps circulating over and over again. So my conclusion, my critique of evolutionary theory as the fact that the origin of life and the creation of the species comes from purely accidental, one step at a time mutation process is as follows. Biology is irreducibly complex. How do you build something one step at a time when you can't take a step out? That's problematic. Information, as we saw, is at the root of our biological reality. That is not the hallmark. Remember the SETI program I talked about? If we applied, do you know how much more complex the information is in our inner space than the one that Jodie Foster found from outer space with the prime numbers coming through? Orders of magnitude more information in our DNA than they would ever hope to find from outer space. Okay, and they got excited in the movie, like, we found intelligence. We just found intelligence right down here. And micro machines read that information and build stuff with that information. Does that sound like purposeless, undesigned, accidental reality to you? If it does, fine by you, but I cannot go there just purely on biological grounds. And interestingly, humans have no known ancestors. It appears we come as a fully unique process in the history of the animal kingdom. So what's interesting here is, what do you do? What do you do when nothing lines up with the prevailing? Remember, 100 years ago, if you'd have said the universe began to exist out of nothing, you'd have been laughed out of university. If you said the reverse today, you'd be laughed out of university. Go to Yale, Harvard, go to the Cambridge School of Astrophysics and say the universe is eternally existent. You'll literally be docked. You'll be mocked and docked. Is it possible that we're going to start to see the co-founder, do you guys remember James Watson and Francis Crick, right? The two guys who discovered the structure of DNA in the 50s. One of them, Francis Crick, has now said, we are not evolutionarily designed. Aliens designed us. He believes in the panspermia model of human origins. So he says, you know what? This is too complex. This is information-based. All the things I said today, he understands better than me. He goes, we clearly were programmed, and then some alien probably had a mass space program where they just started spraying these biological seeds all over the known galaxy to see what would happen. The movie Prometheus, one of the prequels to the Alien series. Have you ever seen Prometheus? The opening of that shows exactly that. Some alien comes down, takes a poison, decomposes, but his DNA goes into the rivers and ponds, and then supposedly that's our origin story. That's what Francis Crick believes in. Interestingly, wouldn't God qualify as an alien intelligence? So in a sense, they're on the right track, but they will go no higher than other creatures as far as our origins, even though all the information points to we are authored and programmed on purpose. And the question is also begged, who designed the aliens? If we can't survive the problem of genetic information, how do they survive it? They did not design themselves. You have to have intelligence to be able to program intelligence, right? Anyways, that is, thank you. You guys are troopers. You guys, this was a literal science class, and you guys are all going to get at least a participation ribbon at the very least. And oh yes, I'm always one slide behind. Could it be that something that looks like a machine, is built like a machine, and it acts like a machine, hard drive, neural circuitry, information-based, is it possible that it is a machine? I'll leave you with that. And we'll do question and answer. If you don't mind, wait for the microphone to ask a question, because it won't get picked up on the live stream if you don't have a microphone. Could I get my Vanna White to come down and help me out? Blaze? So Blaze will bring you the microphone if you have a question or a comment or an objection. Yes.
Hello. I just have a couple of statements. I saw an interview with Dawkins one time. Someone asked him, the living organism that came out of the ooze, the first living thing, how was it created? And he said that it was probably intelligent design. I heard him say that. The other thing is I haven't heard any evolutionists come up with an answer on which came first, the chicken or the egg, or if we evolved from apes, why are there still apes?
From what?
If we evolved from apes, why are there still apes?
Yeah, I mean, the ape thing is, we're not directly from the apes. That's not the current theory, is we share a common ancestor that is extinct. And we're just the cousins that can see each other from across the way. right? Like my great-great-grandparents are dead, but I can see my cousins today. But yeah, no, it's a good point. How do you, to create another human being, you got to have a fully functioning human biology, right, to give birth to a child. And same with even bacteria. For them to split into two bacteria, they have to have fully functioning genetic system. It's a very complex process to do mitosis or meiosis, the act of splitting a one-celled organism into two daughter cells. It's very complex, no room for error. So how do you have that happening one step at a time when every step we can see in that process at the simplest organic level cannot suffer the loss of a single chemical process? That is a genuine critique to be leveled at them, the chicken or the egg scenario.
This question concerning young Earth, old Earth. I take it you don't agree with the scientists at the Creation Science Institute, I think it's called, who argue for the young Earth?
I can go either way, and my whole thing is when I speak about this stuff, I like to speak on terms of the people I'm speaking to. In other words, if I'm talking to a university student who believes in a 4 billion year old Earth, I'll meet them where they're at, and I'll say, there's still problems with your theory, right? Like the Cambrian explosion supposedly happened 500 million years ago, where pretty much all the strata of the rocks of that era show all the main phylum in existence today, all the main species explode within a time frame of 25 million years, which on an evolutionary time frame is too fast, right? So you can present that to them as a problem that they have to deal with. It still bears the hallmark, even on their playing field, still bears the hallmark of non-evolutionary adaptation. Does that make sense? And I can articulate Genesis 1 in an old Earth and a young Earth fashion, where it'll all, I'd say probably honestly, 5 days a week I'm an old Earther, but a creationist old Earther. I don't believe in evolution in any sense of the word. And then 2 days of the week I'm a young Earther. I'm undecided, I'm open-minded, but for the purpose of my discussions, it doesn't even matter, right? Especially a discussion like this. This has nothing to do with timelines, right? What we're made of presents problems no matter what your timeline is, even if you have the longest possible timeline, which is about 500 million years, which actually it's 25 million years, which happened 500 million years ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Would you agree that man has only been on the Earth for 6,000 years, even if you do accept the old Earth theory?
There's problems with the idea that we've only been around for that long, right? There are significant issues. Again, anytime you look at even the dating methods we use to date fossils and artifacts have margins of error that have been proven to be quite wild. And how many times do we look at science from 100 to 200 years ago and realize, man, everyone accepted it back then, turned out to be completely false. So why would I put all my eggs in the basket of our modern dating theories? Some of them seem absolutely locked in accurate, but I reserve the right for them to be wrong.
So how would you go about explaining death before sin came into the world? Thank you for the hard question, right? Anyways, I also wanted to just mention about the owl. The owl is amazing because it has telescopic vision, and if all birds evolved from one bird, then the owl would be blind in every stage of evolution because its eyes don't move. So it can't happen to be part of the bird species that evolved. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Eyes would not see.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you can't see, you probably won't survive.
Yep.
We have a similar thing with the hummingbird. The hummingbird's wings beat about 200 times a minute. And all the other birds don't have that function, so you can't go from a bird to getting towards a hummingbird because the feeding and the way it works just doesn't go that way.
100%.
And my understanding is that DNA and protein were created simultaneously.
Yeah, that's
and
my
you
view.
Can't get away from that.
That's my view. The machine had to come. I mean, even something like the tail, some bacteria have tails that spin, act like a propeller. Other ones do have tails that are just flaccid, not moving. And other ones even have tails that are like a hypodermic needle. They inject poison into their food to destroy it and eat it. And for a while they said, aha, you see, it evolved one step at a time. Now, interestingly enough, the oldest one, as far as we can tell nowadays, the oldest one of those bacterial units was the one with this fully spinning tail propeller. The other ones came later. So the idea that, oh yeah, you had a function before you had the movement function. It acted like a hypodermic needle. But the problem is the hypodermic needle, simpler model came later, not earlier. And it's designed in a different part of the genome. It's a different structure. So it's not like it's a one step at a time. That's been disproven as well, right? And you're right. How do you go, what's a slow hummingbird going to do except run around and hope not to get eaten by a cat? Right?
Exactly. So back to the first question.
I was hoping it wouldn't turn into an old Earth versus young Earth extravaganza.
Well, I've been reading a lot on creation.com,
Yep.
and they are young Earth, and they talk about Noah's flood causing all the fossils. They talk about the dispersion of the continents based on the flood.
Yep.
Grand Canyon flood. It's all flood.
Right.
And it seems to make sense to me more than anything else I've heard.
Yeah. I mean, not to get too quagmired into this particular topic, but I mean, again, I'm open to anything. I just try and look at there are some problems with the idea of a global flood, in the sense that we would need to have water created and then disappeared. We don't have enough water on Earth to create a global flood. That's a fact. We would need to have water created and then removed by some process to achieve that, right? When it says in Genesis, the Genesis account of the flood, and by the way, every single civilization on Earth, including the Aborigines in Australia, have a flood story. It is definitely a common tale that was told at one point before we dispersed to the parts of the world, right? Which is a very biblical view of the flood story. So anyhow, if you have a flood about the size of the Mesopotamian area, that would have covered the entirety of human civilization at the time. And from Noah's perspective, when you take into consideration the curvature of the earth, the nearby mountain chains that would not have been covered by water would have been out of his line of sight from his flood position in the middle of the Mesopotamian valley. That's a possible way to deal with the problem that there wasn't enough water ever on Earth, as far as we can tell, certainly not now, to cover it all, Mount Everest plus 15 feet, whatever it says in the Bible. I'm open to being wrong about that. I'm open to God having, for example, Joshua chapter 10. You cannot get away from the fact that it says the sun stopped for about a day. That's supernatural. There is no natural explanation for that. And people have said, well, you know how many physics components would have to be dealt with? The universe would collapse if everything stopped moving. And I'm like, I could argue that 1,000 ways, but I'm telling you right now, the Bible says unequivocally the sun stopped for about a day. That's at least 12 hours. That's at least 8 hours if you count with the different ways you can say it, about a day. What he had to do, he can do anything. Can God create instantaneously 6,000 years ago? Yes. Yes. When I talk about Genesis chapter 1, I make sure that people can articulate it both in a literal 6 24-hour creation time, which I think is totally possible, and can see, could it accommodate a 6 ages, not 6 24-hour day chronological thing? And the answer to that quickly is yes. If you look at the 6 days of creation, because the word yom for day in the Hebrew, just like the word today in the English, I can say in my grandfather's day or in the day of the dinosaur, I can use the word day to mean an undefined large epoch, right? I think a Christian should be versed in both old and young earth creationist thinking, if that makes any sense. Because at this point, I'm not fully decided. I lean on the side of old earth, but I'm for sure a creationist. And I'm a supernaturalist, 100%.
But the big question comes back to death before Adam.
Yeah, there would have to be animal death before Adam.
It's not biblical.
Okay. That's a topic for a whole nother session. It's fine. That's fine. But you can still use all my genetics material for your argument purposes, right? You got something out of tonight, right? Okay, good. This gentleman had a question, Blaze, right over here. Raise your hand.
Thank you. My son told me 2 weeks ago that he went to 23andMe and found out that our background is 7% Neanderthal. So now I can tell him there's proof that he got ripped off. He spent $200.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard that big of a number as far as the percentage. What they would mean, I've heard 4%, 1 to 4%. Again, that is tenuous at best, right? Because our DNA, just like with the chimpanzee, it's not like our DNA is exactly like that of a chimpanzee in the exact same part of the genome. We have similar structures elsewhere in our DNA, and they count that as a similarity, right? And as I said before, the similarities tend to reside, I think, exclusively for the Neanderthal in the part of the genome that is affected by the adaptive immune system. So what we experience as humans goes into our genetics, so to speak, because of the systemic function of the immune system, and as we carry an adaptive trait, which is then passed on. The exact same similarities between Neanderthal and human exists in sub-Saharan chimpanzees and sub-Saharan humans. We know we can't breed with them, and again, people have tried.
Yes, I didn't believe it, but now that I can direct him to
Yeah.
those.
I thought there was something wrong with you, Pete.
Yeah, my knuckles get worn down a lot, dragging. But, so there's 3 studies?
Well, 3 specimens were used
Three
to
specimens, okay.
draw out the genome.
Okay.
There may have been, this information is about 5 years old that I'm giving you. There may be another, but at the time that I knew my stuff, or that the study that I'm quoting was 5 years old. Yeah. We're going to call it a wrap. Last chance for a question or comment. Right there.
Hi. Back to the Galapagos Island and the different finches. How would you explain that? Like the
Yes.
different finches with different beaks.
Yeah, in a genetic library of these finches was obviously pre-existing. They had large beaks, fine beak genetics because they expressed them all, right? Just like we have blue, brown, and green-eyed genes, etc., and different colored hair genes that exist in a population. If it happened to be that having brown hair meant you had almost full access to the food source, in one generation, only brown hair people would survive, right? So the finches that had stubby beaks, they were the ones who were able to eat the food source after a drought. So they're the only ones who survived. So now only stout-beaked finches were around to procreate the next generation. Do you see what I mean? So it didn't create the different size beaks. It just selected for one trait, and that's the only one that survived. Does that make sense? It didn't create anything. It just selected who would survive. Those finches already had different size beaks, genetically programmed.
But there were different sized different finches on different islands.
Yes.
Different features.
Yep.
Different ways.
Correct. Yep.
So here there was a drought, here there was too much water, these ones survived because of that, those ones died because of that. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
I also just wanted to say your thing about Yom. Yom also means a 1 year period of time. So it could have been 6 years, those 6 days. Or it could be like a day is a year or a day with the Lord is 1,000 years. So we could have about a 13,000-year-old Earth. It's possible. Before there was a sun and a moon. So that's a bit difficult.
Any other questions or comments? All right, we'll give it a wrap. Thank you very much. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Thank you.